Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sybil. I'm a second-year CGA student. I'm doing a concentration in international relations and global future and a specialization in global risk. I am the president of the IR Future and the United Nations Committee. Welcome. We have almost 70 people, both online and in person tonight. So thank you very much for your time and for your interest in our topic. We have students from the Center for Global Affairs and also the Cybersecurity Program, and also from the School of Wagner's and Arts and Science, and also programs from Europe and also India. And also thank you so much for all the professors who make time for us to attend our wonderful event tonight. Now I have the honor to introduce Professor Sidhu, who is also the head of the UN specialization. Professor Sidhu, the floor is all yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I didn't know I was on there. Thank you so much. Welcome to everybody. Delighted to have you here. But I suspect, more than anything else, it's really the topic of today that's brought us here. It's very, fortuitous in one way, but also quite tragic. And contrary to rumors, Vladimir Putin is not on our payroll, but he's clearly doing things which is making this event and even the course that we're running so much more relevant, sadly, for all the sort of wrong reasons in many ways. So as the blurb in the flyer says, there are four very clear dangers that has focused our attention globally of the situation scenario around Ukraine. And this, of course, doesn't in no way takes away from the real tragedy of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people themselves, but it really is also of importance to all of us globally, because the repercussions of this are truly global. And there are four key dangers that we can see in the context of Ukraine. Number one, the danger of nuclear use, either deliberately, accidentally, or through misunderstanding. And by golly, we know there's a lot of misunderstanding. Second, what are the implications of what is happening there, also on the whole sort of movement towards disarmament, which already was in all kinds of trouble, and in some ways in recession, if you like. Third, what are the implications of this for non-proliferation? Given what's happening here, is it at all conceivable that other countries that have nuclear weapons or are thinking about nuclear weapons would now even think of giving them up? And last but not the least, of course, is the very unique experience of nuclear power plants now being targeted as well. This, of course, is not the first time that nuclear power plants have been targeted. We've seen that in the case of particularly Iraq, Iran as well, and then Syria too. But this is the one time that you've actually had a nuclear power plant being, held by another force, and it's got all other kinds of repercussions which are worth looking at as well. So there are many questions which come to us because of what's happening in Ukraine. Number one, the whole notion of nuclear use. Second, the prospects of disarmament and non-proliferation, what this means, but also for civil nuclear use in some ways as well. I'm very fortunate, I don't have to answer any of those questions, but I'm delighted to have a fantastic audience, a fantastic panel who are going to take on these questions for us. So I'm going to start with Ambassador Latizara Stoeva, who is the permanent representative of Bulgaria to the United Nations. Is also presently the president of the second committee. And for those of you following development issues, she is also is the president of ECOSOC, which will host the high-level political forum for sustainable development next year. So if you want to attend that, reach out to me later on. But the reason why Ambassador Soeva is here is because she has been following disarmament issues for almost the longest time in her professional career. Ever since she joined in 2002, and actually accession to NATO, Bulgaria's accession to NATO, which is where we met in Sofia, Ambassador Soeva has very much been involved in all of the NPTs, the disarmament processes, the arms control processes, and is very, very conscious of that. So I'm delighted to have you here. Welcome, and looking forward to your perspective from that of a NATO country as well. Next to her is Ambassador Al-Ahmed, who is officially the Director of Disarmament and Arms Control at the Non-Proliferation Department of the Austrian Ministry. But more importantly, he was the President of the first ever meeting of state parties of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The first treaty that bans nuclear weapons. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I don't know how you managed to do that, but even in the process of writing, of organizing that particular event and pushing the whole notion of of humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, he also wrote a book on the process called The Treaty Prohibiting Nuclear Weapons, How It Was Achieved and Why It Matters. Spoiler alert, there are no sort of, salacious pieces to that. He's much too diplomatic for that, but I'm hoping for that to be there as well. And he was very recently awarded the Distinguished Global Leadership in Service of Peace and Disarmament 2021 by the Science Foundation. Last but not least, we have Ray Atchison, who is the Director of Disarmament at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which, for those of you who don't know, is the oldest NGO in the world, dating back to 1915. And in addition to that, Ray Atchison has been a member of the steering group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which not only played an instrumental role in really the Prohibition Treaty, or the Nuclear Ban Treaty as it's called, but also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. Last but not least, she is also the author of the book, very appropriately titled Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy. So welcome to you as well. Welcome to all of you. Let me then start off with actually Ambassador Soeva. We are literally 60 years from the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the last time we came the closest to a nuclear use or the concern about a nuclear use. Are we going to be lucky this time too?
As long as we always stay at the crisis level, I think we will be. And as we know, it's exactly the Cuban crisis that we will see from the integration to actually be warring. So, as we say, we shouldn't waste the crisis. The NPT Review Conference was one such occasion, and despite the fact that it failed, and despite the different readings of the roadmap of Prohibition, this opinion is important that, but for one country, everybody else was really trying to consensus to the parties of the national community together at this particular stage.
So, given the urgency, the immediacy of the threat of use of nuclear weapons, what would you suggest might be done to reduce that need?
Well, I think the answer is actually contained in your question. We have to start with risk reduction. This is one of the issues that we focused on. And let me be clear, we all are vulnerable to nuclear weapons. So as we cannot go from A directly to C circumstances. And I know my panelists will probably disagree with that, but security environment does matter. And if we are realists, we have to take that thing into consideration. But my first suggestion would be risk reduction. And we were very close to consensus on that. At least nobody disputed that, including their powers.
That's correct. Are you as optimistic? Is risk reduction all we need? Are we going to be as lucky?
I never said that's what we need. That is the first step. Immediate step, which is not a substitute for disarmament. Fair
enough. Okay, that's the comment.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm very glad to be here. The first thing I want to say is answer the first question you asked. I think we are in an extremely dangerous moment, and nuclear risks are very high. The risks of using nuclear weapons and it is high because the consequences, if nuclear weapons are so high. How high the probability is, that we don't know. But the probability is certainly not zero. And given that the consequences of nuclear weapons use are completely unacceptable, that makes the risk unacceptably high. So that's the first thing. What we need to do, go a little bit further, my colleague, we actually know each other forever. And we have many discussions that I know your heart is very much in the time there's anyway. But I think the main thing is a conceptual change. Because the risks are high, because the whole idea of nuclear deterrence is based on the use of nuclear weapons, on the threat of use, and on the credible readiness to use these weapons. And this is, at the end of the day, the unsustainable state of affairs if we want to have a sustainable international peace and security. So if we continue in a setup where an increasing number of states is in nuclear deterrence relationships with one another, threatening the use, which is the necessary foundation of nuclear deterrence, eventually we will cross this line. Hopefully we're not there this time, but I think the conclusion is pretty obvious. And if we are realistic, if we are realists, we have to understand that it is rather utopian to continue to believe that this line is not crossed. It's much more likely, much more realistic to understand that the risk is zero.
I tell my students, hope is not necessarily a policy in some ways as well, but how we can manifest that in some ways. But Ray actually said, then the dangers are still there, isn't there? And even if we're just looking at the deterrence relationship and trying to disconnect that, isn't really the danger the presence of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, the root of this problem is the possession of nuclear weapons, but this does tie into what Alex was talking about in terms of deterrence theory, because deterrence theory is used to justify the possession of nuclear weapons, and not just small arsenals. We're talking about still 13,000 nuclear weapons roughly in the world in the hands of 9 countries. We're talking about billions of dollars, up to $70 billion a year being spent to modernize these weapons to extend their lives into the future. So all of this is built around the myth of nuclear deterrence, that these weapons are meant never to be used. But weapons are meant to be used, and weapons, if they exist, will be used. And I think when we're talking about in this moment of trying to reduce risk or de-escalate the situation, it's important to look at deterrence, it's important to look at possession, but it's also important to understand that this mindset, the concept of security through power, through mass violence, is what's gotten us to this moment. And it's an insular idea that allows for things that I think seem very bizarre to those of us on the outside. So for example, this week, despite the heightened tensions, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is starting nuclear war exercises. Why would you do that at a time when the nuclear risk has never been higher and the threat of use has never been more acute than it's been since 60 years ago this month. So I think, you know, steps that need to be immediately taken are canceling nuclear war exercises. Don't engage in fake bomber runs to drop nuclear weapons in Europe right now. They're taking place this week in Belgium. And Russia has announced that it will go ahead then too with its annual nuclear war exercises. So this just inflates the situation that's already incredibly dangerous. The other thing that I see happening right now that I think really needs to stop immediately is this attempt by a lot of mainstream media and political commentators to kind of normalize the potential use of nuclear weapons and to downplay what the effects will be. So if you've been listening to, say, the New York Times daily podcast or reading the New York Times, other outlets too, but I am going to pick on them because they have such a wide readership, they've been talking about devices that are called tactical nuclear weapons. And what you've probably heard if you've listened to any of this is that they're very small weapons, and those are what Russia would likely use in Ukraine, and they won't cause that much damage. But the reality is that the smallest nuclear weapons in Russia's arsenal are roughly the same size as the Hiroshima bomb. And I'm not going to get into all the technical details of that, but we're not talking about weapons that don't have a grave impact, humanitarian impact that Ambassador Kement is talking about.
And thank you for bringing that up, because you know, one thing which absolutely needs to be made very, very clear is that the smallest nuclear bomb is by an order of 10 bigger than the biggest conventional bomb that you can think of. I mean, there is no conventional bomb which comes close to a nuclear weapon at all in that one. But in that context, Ambassador Soiva, why is NATO doing these exercises now?
First of all, I want to make one point clear. The reason nuclear weapons are such a strong deterrence is because of the humanitarian consequences. I don't think there is any better in the world that would argue that nuclear weapons are good. No, they're not. They're very dangerous and should never be used. So, and my country belongs to an alliance which happens to have deterrence, nuclear deterrence, as one of its policies. So the choice why Bulgaria joined that alliance, of course, it's made strategically, and today, even more so, it is the right choice for us, because if we hadn't done that, we might have been in Ukraine. So for us, it is part of the package deal we're signing to. So it's part of our collective security. Why is NATO doing these exercises? I think it's part of the preparedness. I'm not saying that this does help with basically alleviating the threat, but it is part of the preparedness process. Of course, for me, the danger of the use, the risk of use of nuclear weapons is high, but it's not as likely as, for example, that we'll touch upon that later on. And again, for me, the irresponsible rhetoric of possible use of nuclear weapons and cause of fear in the population is more dangerous. I wasn't around in the 60s, but I assume that people were living in real fear, and now it's probably more so because of social media. So for me, irresponsible rhetoric on any side is not acceptable.
It just says that you made the point about, you know, that Bulgaria feels safe because it has nuclear weapons, and Ukraine is probably being threatened because it doesn't. But are we then advocating more countries should have nuclear weapons to feel safe?
We're not advocating that, but as you know, when Ukraine joined that there is Budapest on the security assurance program, and they're guaranteed security and territorial integrity. Right. It didn't happen. So the question to them, and they're asking it themselves, is would they have been in that situation with the weapons? I don't argue that we should have larger arsenals on the contrary. I think that disarmament needs to be taken seriously and needs to be taken out. It's a very Russian question. And it's a very common sense question when it comes to immediate security. problem with nuclear weapons is that it exists, the technology exists. We cannot reverse technology. We cannot reverse the knowledge. So they're going to be there. We need to know how we handle them. As anything that has been invented, and if we look at disarmament, conventional disarmament for that matter, all the classes of weapons that have been abolished because something else came up. And a lot of it, the military forces found not useful anymore. And I participated in great conventions in different processes. The munitions convention happening for the 9-ban treaty, and it was all great treaties. However, with nuclear weapons, it's very difficult to reverse the knowledge. So we need to see how we manage to succeed, right? And how we make progress to diminishing the risks and also the existence, but it takes time. And given the security environment again, I know that everybody thinks that excuse, but it is real. And if you're policymakers, you're gonna have to take decisions given the security environment. It's not possible to reach disarmament now. It still remains a purpose, and we need to collectively see how we reduce the risk so we can move forward.
On the Budapest memorandum, which you very rightly pointed out, UK and the United States are also guarantors of that, and we haven't seen. By the way, so is Russia, but that's a different issue. You know, what happens when the memorandum like that breaks down? You haven't seen that kind of commitment from the others guarantors for that. But and we come back to that in a bit, and particularly the disarmament part as well. But Ambassador, turning to you, nuclear weapons can't be uninvented. So what's the advantage or benefit of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons?
I think it's obvious nothing that has been invented can be uninvented. What can change is the attitude towards something that has been invented, and specifically when it comes to weapons categories. It's very difficult to imagine states giving up nuclear weapons as long as they consider them to be desirable. When we have been able to make progress on designing on weapons categories, is because the attitude changed. And the way to do that is quite convinced of that is through a public discourse and discourse on the what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. For example, landmines, not that they've been completely documented. We have a treaty that has changed the attitude towards these weapons because they are simply unacceptable from a humanitarian law. So responsible states do not want to use these weapons. And I think the same approach is valid when it comes to nuclear weapons because they are at the moment still desirable for some countries because they are given particular status. They are seen as equivalent with status of power. And the question on the military, on the actual military utility is a very complex one which we probably don't have time to go into. But it is assumed that's the logic behind the possession of nuclear weapons, is that they are actually not going to be used because they deter. But what's the evidence of that? As Ray has said, if you have weapons, the likelihood that they are going to be used is very high. And the minute you start actually talking about nuclear weapons not as an abstract concept, but as a weapon that is a very direct, concrete, unacceptable impact, that can change the attitude. I think we are actually at an extremely crucial moment now in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, of why this crisis is going on. We see some arguing for the conclusion nuclear weapons are absolutely essential. And the argument that if Ukraine had kept its weapons, it may be in a different spot right now, makes the argument. The logical conclusion of this argument is the proliferation of nuclear weapons. that's extremely dangerous. Because if we think this through, we end up with a vast number of countries having these weapons. Is that then a more secure world? So the only alternative is to look at nuclear weapons through the lens of a conceptual change in the attitude towards these weapons. And that's exactly what the TPNW is doing. So that was a long way to answer the question that you asked me. That's the important aspect. It's based, first of all, it's based on empirical evidence around what we know today about humanitarian consequences, a better understanding of the whole complexity of risks around nuclear weapons. It makes the argument that if you look at this evidence, you ought to draw different conclusions as to the value and status and utility of these weapons. That's a discursive process, it's a difficult process. I understand that, but I think it's the only way. And the situation that we have right now with this heightened risks, I think dramatically underscores this case, because the alternative of it, in my view, is proliferation in the world with many more states seeking these weapons, which will ultimately be terribly to the detriment of the security of all.
Yeah, just turning to you, new weapons cannot be uninvented. You're also on the steering committee of Stop Killer Robots. So should they be preempted in some ways? Number one. Second, what does civil society do with this while the diplomats are saying nothing can be done?
Sorry, for your first question, should killer robots be prevented? Is that what you're saying, or should nuclear?
Well, the argument was that nuclear weapons cannot be uninvented.
Yeah. And
so, that we're on the cusp of killer robots. Some might argue we are already there. But so should we prevent the
development of killer robots?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So
how do you go about that as a civil society actor?
Right. So we are actually seeing in this complex the use of artificial intelligence and weaponized artificial intelligence software and designs in a way that we haven't really seen before. So the preventive aspect of the Stop Killer Robots campaign is shifting as we get closer and closer to development and deployment of fully autonomous weapon systems, which are weapons that will operate outside of meaningful human control. So the way that I usually try and explain this to people is if you think of a drone that's currently operated by remote control, so someone is steering it, someone is analyzing the data that is being sent back by the drone, and then deciding to fire upon a target, if that's a person or a building, and then actually pushing the button to make that happen. What we're thinking about in terms of autonomous weapon systems is getting to a point where that drone is operating by itself. So it will be deployed, it will be programmed with algorithms. And if you think about, what we already know the problems are with, say, facial recognition, voice recognition, gait recognition, all of this technology that's having such a damaging effect in terms of policing and surveillance domestically. If we think about that technology being weaponized, a drone being able to determine based on its programming that this building houses legitimate targets that it wants to hit, and then firing upon that target without human intervention. So that's sort of where things are going right now in military technologies. There's a whole lot of range to this, of course. I'm talking about one edge of it, but we're seeing already there's a new Israeli gun, for example, using facial recognition that they put up. So we are seeing this technology being used. So yeah, we're working in civil society to prevent the development of that technology at the same time that we're trying to prevent nuclear war. So I guess the heart of your question is how do we do all that? And
how effective is it?
Well, ask these two. I mean, I think some of our work is extremely effective without civil society, and I think Ambassador Kent would agree with me, but without ICANN, there wouldn't be a TPNW. It was the pushing from civil society, the corralling states giving heart to the process, courage to the process, building a community of actors willing to take this initiative against the interests of the nuclear armed states that help build up both a body of knowledge, but also a community that could act in order to create new international law. So there's a very symbiotic relationship, partnership that can happen in that way between states and activists. But of course, there's also often an inherent antagonism between activists and governments at times. And so when you're dealing with, rather than like-minded governments, when we're dealing with, say, like the nuclear armed states, then a lot of it is about circling around the structures of power, including the economics and the politics and the sort of moral justifications that are employed by the state in order to justify or in a way that its behavior. So in the context of anti-nuclear organizing, for example, that looks like right now this week, people in Belgium outside of the NATO headquarters trying to call on steadfast noon to be canceled, or it looks like folks going to US military bases or nuclear sites, test sites, and doing protests there. It looks like people getting city councils across nuclear armed states and NATO countries to call out their federal governments for not supporting the TPNW and for supporting nuclear deterrence. So here in New York City, for example, last year we were successful in getting the New York City Council to endorse the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, call on the US government to join, but then also take a very practical step of agreeing to divest all of New York City pension funds from all nuclear weapon producers. So these are things that are happening in cities around the United States and throughout Europe and any country that doesn't yet support the TPNW. So divestment has been such a successful part of other campaigns. Going on with fossil fuels right now is also successful with landmines and cluster bombs in the past. And I think the other element that we really try and bring to the fore in our work, whether it's on killer robots or nuclear weapons or whatever weapon system we're after, we always try and think about the broader humanitarian and environmental landscape. So for nuclear weapons, it's not just about the moment of use, the moment of detonation of the weapon in an act of war, which we saw in 1945 when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. But we've also had 2,000 nuclear weapon tests around the world, primarily on indigenous lands in the Pacific, in Australia, in the United States. We've seen the harm that's been caused from that testing that's gone on. We've seen the harm from uranium mining. We've seen the harm from radioactive waste storage. All of this happens primarily on land of indigenous people or within or near poor communities, often communities of color, causing immense environmental and human health catastrophes. And that's without ever dropping a nuclear bomb on a city. So that's something that we really try to do in our work as well, to bring that into the conversation so that the arguments that some governments make that deterrence works and these weapons are never to be used, we can point to, look at the harm these weapons are causing without ever being detonated.
Absolutely. There was a nuclear test conducted by the United States on the 1st of March 1953 called Castle Bravo. It was conducted on what was not then called the Bikini Atoll. But here's the thing. The fallout from that one test, the 15 megaton test, spread globally. Everyone born after the 1st of March 1959 or 53 has a little bit of Bravo in there. It lasts as long as that. But on the other element of the disinvestment, certainly money talks, and that may be one way to think about it. But also, I think, if you look at the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, while Reagan and Gorbachev were seen as the heroes and the signatories, it was in fact women's movements, particularly in the against disarmament in United Kingdom and in Germany and in Europe, which also put a lot of pressure on these leaders to negotiate and bring it together as well. So there has been that movement as well. But let me for a moment sort of reluctantly concede that we can all agree on a world without nuclear weapons, and that's where we're heading towards, right? But are we? I mean, look at the abject failure of the NPT review conference on the 50th anniversary of the treaty, on the 25th anniversary of its indefinite extension, and I'd be curious to see, your kind of reaction on what pathways we might look at, because clearly the NPT is not working.
I'm not arguing it is working perfectly, but I think it's better to have it than not to have it. And just before that, Alex talked about proliferation, risk of proliferation. Basically, besides the 5 nuclear states, the United States and the rest parties to and states, for all of us, and with this under NPT, are legal. So I think that as long as the NPT is there,
But not banned.
they are illegal. We cannot have the rights to have them. And they're still not banned because those 5 countries, they're illegal for the rest of the world, but for these 5 particular nuclear weapon states, they're not illegal. At TPNW, it's banned, but the reality is that NPT allows 5 nuclear weapon states to have nuclear weapons. For the rest of us, they're not legal and we do not possess them. So they don't have an issue with the rest of us. But as long as the NPT is there, I think the risk of proliferation is lower than not having the NPT there. And I wanted also to say that civil society has played a crucial role, and I also agree, not just Alex, that without ICANN there wouldn't have been TPNW. But not only that, without civil society, we would have the documentation treaty as well, many other processes. So civil society has a very big role to play. Agree with Ray that if societies reach to a level where they would say that disarmament is needed now, and yet their governments, after all, people are the ones that elect governments, so governments have to listen. So if you have very strong grassroots movements against terrorists, they might reach somewhere. In the 60s, you haven't, and it brought NPT to be born. So I guess if we have a very strong movement of that kind, we might get some impetus for disarmament. But as I said, I think that we're talking about the same thing, which is that we have different approaches to how we get there. And of course, nobody ever argues that nuclear tests are good, and that's why we have to confidence in nuclear test countries. Unfortunately, it's not enforced, but it has stigmatized nuclear tests to a very high degree. And it's 25 years that it hasn't been enforced, but there are moratorium on nuclear testing. You have some rogue states that might conduct here and there, but in general, there is a moratorium.
Alex, are you as optimistic of the NPT success?
I didn't call it a success.
Existence. Yeah.
I agree, of course, that proliferation would be much more dangerous without it. So we're never going to even argue against the NPT. But it's not working at all. It's not working. And we saw again in August when this review conference failed, there is now a kind of fight for the narrative. And the narrative that is being presented is that if only Russia hadn't blocked consensus on this, it would have been a successful conference and we would have had consensus. And I'm pushing back against this. Yes, it's true, Russia blocked. So we didn't have the option for progress, but what was on the table certainly wasn't representative of a successful conference. Specifically with respect to the disarmament, it was extremely disappointing. The reason why all the NPT membership was ready to go along with it is because we want to preserve these treaties. We don't want them to disappear. So we were ready to swallow something that's really very bad for the sake preserving a multilateral regime which is under terrible pressure. But what was again extremely obvious is that there is no reference whatsoever from nuclear arms states to actually make progress on nuclear disarmament in a sort of directional sense. It really moving away from reliance on nuclear weapons. And the same actually goes for states that nuclear umbrella relationships. When we hear talk about the shared objective of the work about nuclear weapons, I'm skeptical. Because what it really means is, I think everybody would agree, we would prefer a world in which there would not be a nuclear. But that's the sort of then we are at the point in time to uninvent these weapons. And because these weapons are unfortunately there, we have to live with it. But that is not actually taking concrete steps the conceptual way of trying to do it. So implementing the NPT on the nuclear disarmament side for me would mean actually thinking about what are the steps that are necessary to really move away from it. And I think that's where I think that is so essential. We're not going to get there in the NPT. For me, that's unfortunately absolutely clear because the vested interests in keeping these weapons are so strong. So the NPT needs conceptual help, and that comes from the TPNW. And I think this is why we are adamant that the TPNW is fully complementary to the NPT because it actually helps with the implementation of the disarmament obligation. Yes, the nuclear weapon states have been recognized in the NPT to have these weapons, but it's not, certainly not from the perspective of the vast majority of states, gives them the right to keep these weapons. It's a conditional possession of these weapons, but it's conditioned with credible steps towards disarmament, and that's that part of the bargain simply is not there, and is not taking place. So non-nuclear weapon states have come together to give it an extra push. And the way we can do that is through the normative pressure. And I think that's what the TPNW does. We will make progress on this issue if the nuclear weapons discourse is taken out of an exclusive security policy expert bubble. It needs to be connected to wider segments of society. And I think focusing on understanding the humanitarian consequences and risks of what these weapons would actually do if deterrence fails or if there is an accident, that's the way to engage. And that's why, of course, working together, governments and civil society, and that cross movement was so crucial. That's the way to connect this issue to wider segments of society, and that's the only way of making progress on this issue.
And certainly, I think the other sort of consensus on the panel is that the NPT is not working, or is in some kind of trouble anyway, right? And I think, as you rightly mentioned, that this time Russia blocked it. In the past, we've seen UK and UK and the US block it for different reasons as well. So ironically, the three depository states of the NPT are the ones who will also be responsible for holding it back as well. I am going to turn to all of you because I know you're brimming with questions and comments that you want to jump into in just a minute. But Alex, I want to just follow that up a little bit more on the TPNW. Of course, it's just entered into force, had a very successful, very ambitious outcome of the first meeting of state parties. I think a 50-point action plan, etc. I know it's only been a year, 2 years. But when do you think the TPNW is going to disarm its first nuclear weapon?
That's a tricky question. Since people are watching on this Zoom, that's the argument that is made by the skeptics. Yeah? We are not party to it, so the treaty is irrelevant. It's not going to disarm any single weapon. Whether or not nuclear weapon states are party to the TPNW that would be great. But that's actually not the key for me at that moment. What the TPNW does is this conceptual change. The TPNW is the international community is voting with their feet on the legitimacy of the nuclear weapon status quo. And that's the power of international law, and I happen to believe in that, even though international law is very gravely challenged now on both fronts. Very much so by Russia, but not only. I mean, the whole international law system is challenged, but I believe that ultimately it's crucially important. So if the international community is increasingly rallying around the prohibition, the comprehensive prohibition of nuclear weapons, thereby demonstrating the lack of legitimacy and also the illegality, even though it may not be considered as customary international law, but it's still a manifestation of the view of the international community. That's a very powerful pressure. If that then leads nuclear weapon states to take credible steps, let them do that and not join the TPNW. As long it's about progress, it's about moving the world away from the nuclear madness. And any step that does that is important. The TPNW is a lever. So if many states come on board, that strengthens the normative side, but at the end of the day, we want to see action. And how that action then is achieved is secondary. It's important that it is achieved. And I think that's where the TPNW is important, even if it already has a transformational impact. It has had it even in its very short lifespan so far. And I think that's what makes me optimistic about the prospect of the treaty. Because we are building this norm, and it has an impact even beyond the strictly speaking membership. I think it works at the legal, on a legal plane, and it works on a political plane. And the political plane is very much linked to international legitimacy. And I think that's an important.
And one thing you talked about, really kind of challenging the concept of nuclear deterrence as being something which has been central to this treaty's kind of impact and success as well.
That's what it ultimately is. Yeah. It's if I can just say, it's in a nutshell, it's nuclear deterrence is fraught with uncertainties and it's based on a lot of assumptions. We don't actually know if it works. If it works, fine, but we don't know if it works the next day, the next circumstance. What we know is the massive level of humanitarian consequences and risks, and there we actually have evidence. So the argument is we need to weigh the assumptions and uncertainties behind the concept of nuclear deterrence with the empirical evidence of the consequences and risks. And that ultimately, in our view, leads to a must-have discussion on the veracity of the assumptions on which nuclear deterrence is based. That's a long-term proposition. It's difficult. It's a discursive process, but I think it's extremely powerful. I think the arguments are extremely powerful and will hopefully have this transformational impact. If not, I think the conclusion is more nuclear weapons, more proliferation, and much easier.
I am going to turn to all of you after I ask Ray this question about Ray, where you and the organization have been very diligently following both the NPT and have been instrumental really in the birth of the TPNW and its kind of success as well. Do you see these two as adequate? Or do you see that there's a need for something even further in terms of nuclear weapon prevention or something else where you might want to see this sort of progressing further and faster?
In terms of the legal framework, the TPNW has what we need. It created space deliberately in terms of nuclear disarmament for the nuclear armed states to set the parameters largely themselves when they come on board, because we knew that it would be just another reason for them to reject the treaty if they said, oh, we didn't negotiate the ways that we would eliminate our nuclear weapon program, so we're not going to join that. So instead of setting ourselves up to be a punchline in their jokes in that way, the negotiators of the treaty very skillfully, I think, carved out space for the details of actual dismantlement and elimination of nuclear weapons programs to be dealt with, but it can be done within the treaty framework. And it, it stipulates that it has to be verifiable, and it has now, at the meeting of states parties, taken the decision that they would have to do it within a 10-year time frame, with possible exceptions, so similar to the way that the Chemical Weapons Convention works. So this has been all very thought through, and I think whether the nuclear armed states do it through the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, whether they decide to negotiate elimination bilaterally, multilaterally themselves in some other instrument, I don't think any of us care. I think that's what Ambassador Kmen was saying too. Whatever the TPNW can do to propel us towards disarmament means the TPNW is a success. I think it could be used itself. If it's not used, if something else is used, I don't mind. As long as the weapons are gone, I'm happy. And I think, in terms of sort of the conceptual work that needs to be done around this to build on what Ambassador Kmen was saying in terms of normative change, I think that is where the TPNW is really instrumental. And I think it's also where we have a lot to learn from past social movements and how social change has been created in different countries. But for example, in this country, the abolition of slavery, right? Slavery was once treated as economically indivisible for the country, and abolitionists were treated as crazy, as people that were naive and ridiculous to think that you could ever end this practice, which was holding up the economy of what was the United States, or called the United States. But of course, the normative change that was built from actions, incredibly courageous actions of people who were told day in and day out that they would never succeed, is what led eventually to the overthrow of this horrific system. And that, of course, did not solve the problem. We then have segregation, we then have civil rights movement, we have incredibly entrenched white supremacy and racism within this country. And I think that's something that we have to always recognize in our work as activists or as other government and official stakeholders that are trying to make change, is there's no snapping your fingers and fixing the problem. These problems are entrenched. But we're often, as TPNW supporters, as anti-nuclear activists, we're often accused of just wanting to snap our fingers and when is the treaty going to eliminate its first nuclear weapon, those types of questions. Right. But we understand more than anybody else, it's not about snapping your fingers. This is a long game that we're in. But the only way that you are ever going to make the change is if you start building the alternative norms, the alternative discourse and narrative. You start challenging what the mainstream holds to be credible. This is the only way that change has ever been made throughout human history. And it's going to work on nuclear weapons unless they kill us first. Yeah, that's something which brings us back to the center of this discussion, the debate as well. Questions from the audience? Please identify yourself very briefly. Fantastic. Maybe Maya, please go ahead. We maybe take a couple of them and then we can go ahead. Yeah, Amalia, please. Yeah.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
Hi. I'm Amalia from Alpine. I'm a master's student today. My concentration is in international relations. So both, I guess, like the topic of deterrence and looking at deterrence specifically is kind of conventionally and like normatively become an aspect of military strategy and just kind of a posture in general. So in the event that disarmament occurs successfully, what reduces the value of outright U.S. deterrence?
We'll take one more from this end here. Yes, please. Yeah. Please.
I can talk about
No, we want to, yeah.
Hi, I'm Chad Shroy, a master's in the cyber concentration. And bringing it back to kind of the central point of this panel, I wanted to say that from an earlier point, I wholeheartedly agree that nuclear exercises being held by NATO kind of puts us on the path of an escalation cycle that diminishes our ability to de-escalate in the future. And given Putin's entrenched position with what he calls his special military operation, I foresee the immediate challenge is convincing him and the big four, him, Gerasimov, Sorov, and Ivanov, that using nuclear weapons is not in their interest. And so how do we go about convincing them, which is, I guess, a little bit of detraction from the theoretical debate of deterrence and disarmament, and a more immediate concern.
So right here and now, I suppose. So two questions, one, the here and now, the immediate sort of concern, and the other slightly more long term. Would like to begin. This is such a polite panel. We'll start with you.
What will they be replaced? I'm afraid it would be something worse. If nuclear weapons are being used, it would be because something worse is developed. I hope that's not true, but it could be the answer to that. For the second question, that's exactly deterrence. Deterrence is to convince Putin that it's not. I mean, it's the Russian Federation that was part of the our statement just in January, which made us that the march could not be launched never before. However, we've seen other claims. I think our rhetoric needs to come down. Again, I think the risk is high, but it's not as probable. I think there is it's more likely than I use it.
Two very good questions. For the first one, I don't think the TPNW states parties are against deterrence as a concept. They're against nuclear deterrence because of the evidence of consequences. So there will probably and has always been deterrence in interstate relations, and as much as we probably would wish, but that's not the case, I think probably it's safe to assume that that will remain. I find it interesting that, in a way, part of the response from NATO has actually been non-nuclear deterrence. And I think that's really important. I'm grateful that NATO's response to Russia's threats was not immediately jumping on the escalation level as well. I think we have the attempt to have actually built the most comprehensive economic set of sanctions, which is deterrence. And we have tried to have a global condemnation. And there we've been successful but less so. And I think part of the reason is some of the credibility deficits and some of the issues that all countries have. So now, and that's partly answering your question, how do you convince someone not to use these weapons? You can do that by saying if you use these weapons, we use them too. But of course, that's not that. At the end of the day, it's not a very moral argument when we're talking about clear threat of worse violation of international law. I think the way to do it is to really have a credible global response in terms of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And that is part of the problem, that as long as you are in a nuclear deterrence relationship, is you actually threatening the same thing. You're not probably saying it as drastically as Putin is doing, but in a way, concept fundamentally is the same. So that's part of the problem, and I think that partly explains why the General Assembly is asked to vote on the condemnation of Russia. You have unfortunately some countries that, I mean, you have some, you have 5 that vote with Russia. That's not a particularly good company of states, but you have about 40 or 50 who abstain, and they shouldn't abstain. And the reason why they abstain is part of the credibility issues when it comes to nuclear weapons. That's unfortunately the case. So I would argue, to answer the question, I would argue to make it absolutely clear that any use of nuclear weapons under any circumstances is completely unacceptable. And this is what the TPNW states parties have done. At the declaration in Vienna, we have unequivocally condemned any and all nuclear threats, whether implicit or explicit, irrespective of the circumstances. So that's a categorical rejection of threats of nuclear weapons. And of course, countries that themselves rely on nuclear weapons cannot do that. And I think that's, I mean, it's a very critical issue.
Might having a resolution, the first committee on something like that be one way to go?
It's too late for this year.
I know. Great. Over to you.
I agree with Master Khan's answers to the second question, so I think I'll just focus on the first one, which for me, I think, and as working for an organization that has been around since 1915 and opposed to world wars and every other war that's happened in that time frame for the past 100 years, but that also pushes for this kind of reconceptualization or building up alternative narratives and discourses from a feminist perspective for all this time. Part of our work is to not just look at what happens to the world when you snap your fingers and eliminate nuclear weapons, right? And it's the same world with all of its same problems, but we actually look for a process that helps us turn away from the entire concept of weapons for security, of a world that invests more than $2 trillion a year collectively on militarism, on weapons, on wars, on armies, etc., while people starve and while climate chaos intensifies every single year. And what is it that we need to actually be investing in radically, quickly, right now? What are the shifts that need to be happening in government policy? What is it that citizens of countries, people living in countries, need to be doing in order to compel those shifts and to take away our implicit consent for the choices that our governments are making in terms of where money is spent? And the entire framing of militarism, of in order to be safe, you need weapons. In order to, be a powerful player in the world and be taken seriously, you have to have the most powerful weapons, the most destructive weapons. You need to be able and willing to commit genocide, to wipe out entire cities with the press of a button. Metaphorical, not literal. And I think this is the whole concept that we urgently need to confront. And I think this is happening at different levels as well throughout society, thinking about policing. Does policing keep us safe? Who does policing keep safe? Who is harmed by that? And taking that up to the broader level of global politics as well, and asking those questions of who is this actually protecting when we talk about security? Whose security are we talking about, and who is suffering?
I know you want to come in, but I'm going to take a couple more questions and then we do the floor again. I just want to jump in there.
Yes, I just wanted to seize the opportunity to maybe slightly disagree with you. I don't disagree with the desirability of what you said, but bringing it back to the TPNW, I think I look at the TPNW not as a treaty that's related to the peace movement approach. I look at the TPNW as a sort of a realist treaty based on way very profound security arguments and then coming out clearly on the side of international law and international humanitarian law. But because nuclear weapons on balance are a security threat rather than a benefit. That, in my view, is how the TPNW membership looks at the TPNW. It doesn't change the fact that there are enormous amount of structural issues that need to be tackled. But the TPNW itself, I don't think, I mean, it may lead the discourse in this direction, but the way it is at the moment, I think the argument is a sort of, it's a hard realist argument.
Going to take a last couple of questions. Yes, Sarah there.
That's time for one more.
Time for one more only?
Yeah.
All right, okay. We're gonna take, Jeff, we take two. Brief one. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us. My name is Sarah, I'm the International Development Concentration. As you underscored the last episode, I'm concerned, as you all are, about the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. My question is about the JCPOA, more commonly referred to as the Iran nuclear deal. And as we're hearing that negotiations earlier in the year were promising, more recently, but completely stalled. Both sides are not coming to the table. Whether on the U.S. side that's because of their pushback from Israel or because of the increased mass protests in Iran. Either way, it seems like neither side is coming to the table anytime soon. So my question is two prongs in that. One, what do you think that means for non-proliferation globally? If the Iran deal is off the table. And also, looking at it from a UN lens, I guess I would say, do you think that the UN can play a role in any mediation or negotiation? Of course, I think we all know that the UN is not the end all be all. They do some things very well and have done some things very well. Do you think that the UN can play a role in negotiating some sort of treaty or re-entry into the JCPOA? Yeah, that's my question.
And also, ask you to Riaz as well, because he's working on something. But Jeff, with your permission, maybe one last question at the back there. It's the very the back there. One more people. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you so much for accommodating the question. I'm still wondering about the illegality of the use of nuclear weapons, because when I look at the term illegal, my assumption is that there's going to be a consequence to me participating in this act. And I'm just wondering, what are the consequences in case things go sour and someone does end up pressing the button that launches the nuclear war? What are the consequences? And are the consequences for the person launching nuclear weapons as a self-defense mechanism or in a retaliatory manner going to be lesser than the person who makes the first move?
Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Jeff, for allowing us that. We are going to wrap it up with this. With Ray, I'll start with you and then go down this way.
I think the other two are better suited to address these questions. In terms of illegality, at least we have a lot of law on this. We have the International Court of Justice opinion from 1996. We have the UN Charter itself. We have international humanitarian law. We have the TPNW. And so the use of nuclear weapons, I feel, is from multiple directions not allowed and illegal. The consequences, I think what you're asking is not are the physical, humanitarian, environmental impacts, but the legal consequences. So that's a question more for, I think, the government reps in the room of what could actually happen. I imagine a variety of responses would be possible. But this is a question about international law really writ large. And, the questions that we get from people that are concerned with international law and enforcement of international law. I think where international law is most powerful is really in the preventative force that it can bring to these situations. So, which is why we're so focused right now on trying to prevent the use of nuclear weapons by stigmatizing and condemning the threats that have been made as having gone way too far.
Thank you. On the JCPOA question, that's of course very disconcerting. The JCPOA really was an absolute jewel of multilateral negotiations, and it's tragic what has happened. And of course, recently, I mean, yes, the US pulled the plug, but the actions that Iran has taken in the last 2 years have been very negative. And of course, the consequences for proliferation, specifically in the Middle East, are extremely dangerous. And I think there are several countries who may be then on the verge of going down the similar route, and I think that then really would be so I think it's really, really dangerous. I don't think the UN can play much of a role in that process. But I wanted to say, I mean, part of the issue, and I'm really a great supporter of the JCPOA, but there is a certain irony, of course, that all the actors who are telling Iran not to develop nuclear weapons will lie themselves. I think that doesn't change the fact that it's right to tell Iran wants to have this weapon, but it points to the sort of structural problems that we have. Issues. You want to answer the question?
On the consequences, yeah.
On the legal consequences, you have to ask the nuclear weapon states. You don't run the risk of the legal consequences. One thing is for sure, the world is not prepared for a response in case of the use of nuclear weapons. We have no preparations for that. There are no scenarios that are going to be successful. So facing the disaster of nuclear weapons, regardless of how you prepare, you cannot prepare. In terms of security, and I want to go back to something Ray said, it's not so much about peace movement, but the only guarantee for security is international law, especially for implementation and strict observation of the norms of international law. It's not reliance on alliances, military alliances, it's international law. And when Ambassador Clement was referring to the resolution on Ukraine, the latest one last week, this was the message that was sent. It wasn't so much about Ukraine, it was about principles, because the arguments of all these 143 countries that supported it, that tomorrow it could be me. So from that perspective, as a small state, and any state for that matter, the only guarantee that you have for your security is international law and strict observation of rules, as we have set them to ourselves. Of course, the military aspect is there, we cannot go without it, but we should all focus on international law and how we can implement it. And when you refer to the UN and the JCPOA, don't forget that UN is member states, it's all of us. So when we accuse the UN of failures, we are actually the ones that are responsible for anything the UN does not succeed. So it's us that we have to ask ourselves what we did wrong and why we didn't go. But on JCPOA, I think it's very important that we preserve it. This is one of the best achievements that we could have had. And the Security Council endorsed it, and it was working until, of course, the previous administration decided to walk out of it. And now it's difficult to go back to where we were. But JCPOA is the only way forward because the risk of proliferation is high.
Well, we could certainly have gone on with both the questions and the topics as well. We haven't touched on many of the issues that that we began with. It's going to be a long conversation. Hopefully, we followed up in other settings as well and through the week. But at this moment, let me call on Naje Nunes to give the vote of thanks to our brilliant panelists. Oh, okay. It's working. It's on. Okay.
Excellencies and distinguished guests, faculty and staff, students, well-wishers, all those in the hearing of my voice, those here in person and those at space. Hello, a pleasant afternoon to you all. My name is Naje Nunes and I am the president of the Student Association for Global Affairs. And I have been endued the great honor this afternoon of doing the vote of thanks. And as Henry VIII said to his fourth wife, you won't be here for long. I say the same to you, because I tend to keep my remarks as brief as possible, so just bear with me. This has indeed been a very fiery discussion that has canvassed many things, including the prospect of nuclear weaponization, discouraging disarmament commitments, the specter of proliferation, and the seizure and attacks on nuclear power plants. All in all, a situation that is very fraught with danger and has great propensity for future conflicts. Alas, if the intent of academia is not to understand the world in order to change it, if so, discourses like these are critical for us to have. And this is why the Center for Global Affairs and the Student Association for Global Affairs, and of course our IR1 committee, is so pleased to have convened this event on Ukraine and nuclear dangers. And in no particular order, I first wish to thank our distinguished panelists, of course, Ambassador Kent, Ambassador Stova, and Director Edgerson, for enriching the scholarship of the CGA this afternoon, of course, with your fire of thoughts and interventions. And at this time, we have brief morsels of our appreciation that we'd like to present to you. So I'm going to call on Jeff Sloan, who is the Director of Public Relations for the International Relations, Global Futures, and United Nations Committee, to make brief presentations to our presenters. Can I ask you briefly to stand for a photo op? Can we give them a round of applause, please? We hope with this you will remember the CJ for years to come, and we look forward to welcoming you here again in the near future. Yeah. Thank you so much. Awesome. I also wish to extend gratitude to our deft and diligent moderator, Professor Sidhu, who has, thank you, he has been diligent, not only in planning, but certainly the execution. He's been vital, so we appreciate your patronage. Also want to thank the Iron Fund Committee and my Saga team for organizing this event, the first installment of our diplomatic dive, so stay tuned for others in the imminent months. Also to the faculty and staff who have fully supported our event, your patronage has not gone unnoticed, and we're fully appreciative of all your efforts that you have done and continue to do. And to you, our dear students, at the heart of everything we do, thank you so much for attending. You are the reason that we convene this event, and hope that you will continue to attend all our events in the future. And so to wrap up, we are welcome to help yourself to the refreshments in the back. They are here for you. And you are also invited, courtesy of Saga and IR Fund, to our cocktails event that is going to be convened at the Malt House. The Saga team, Sybil and Kiran and Jeff will all be guiding you there. So just follow their direction in a few moments. And from here, it's a short stroll so we can saunter there together. And of course, the IR Fund team will be leading the way. And so I hope the flames of today's discussion has ignited something in you, and I hope that those interests will continue to be emboldened and pushed forward, as of course, as the CJ continues to encourage you in any way we can. And we look forward to continuing to serving you and your interests. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you.